Hello everybody, welcome back to the Tokyo FinTech podcast. Today we present your discussion on Insurtech in APAC that we hosted jointly with the Global Insurtech Alliance. And I've taken myself out of the discussion here, so you will hear the voices of George Kesselman, who's the president and founder of Insurtech Asia, Jason Roberts as the founder of Insurtech New Zealand, and Rita Yates, who's the CEO and co-founder of Insurtech Australia. The discussion is moderated by Dwyer, who's the CEO and co-founder of Vallum.Insure, and I'll leave you in Kai's trusted hands from here on out.
A warm welcome, everybody, to our first GITA Insurtech webinar. In today's session, we're going to be listening to some of the developments that are happening in Australia and New Zealand, as well as Singapore and Southeast Asia. This is the first in a series of events, similar introductory events that other GITA partners are going to be hosting. I'll just frame up maybe where we're at. Insurtech, what is Insurtech? It's the use of technology innovations that are designed to make the current insurance model more efficient and to deliver better outcomes for customers. In a nutshell, it tends to cover those two things, efficiency and great customer outcomes. And although technology innovation has been around for decades, I've got a lot of grey hairs, I've been in the industry a long time, Insurtech as a label on what technology does in insurance really sort of started appearing around 2010 when there was a massive uplift in the focus on technology and the insurance industry and its very traditional practices. Contrary to some views, Insurtech is not just about disruption. All Insurtechs are not there to disrupt everybody. It's as relevant to long-established insurance providers as it is to the startups and all other organizations that are actually part of the insurance value chain. And so we're really about the entire insurance ecosystem, and we welcome all of those participants and those who have an interest in the insurance industry and how it's developed. Now, before we get into the heart of the webinar, I also wanted to just summarize some points in the interests of maximizing the use of our time, the background of COVID-19, because otherwise we'd have each of our panelists probably repeating some of the same kind of comments. So we did a quick chat a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to basically summarize where things stand as a result of COVID-19. So it's not possible to avoid talking about it right now, but as far as Insurtech's concerned, COVID has had a consistent impact across most markets. And the really positives out of that is that it's increased the urgency that has been felt around digitization and changing the way of work. And we've actually got examples as well where COVID-19 accelerated development of products into market and investments in ventures. But we've also seen for earlier startup ventures, I think, a slowdown in that environment. So it's rather like Charles Dickens said, it's the best of times and the worst of times. So the investment climate has dried up. And in fact, in January, Insurtech Worldwide still had a $450 million investment in about 9 or 10 ventures from around the world. And that dried up by March to about only $45 million. And the other thing that has been a real challenge as a result of COVID-19 has been the self-isolation and the travel restrictions. And that's largely because new ventures have short runways, limited investment. And so anything that prevents them from forging partnerships and collaboration is a challenge and means they have to review carefully their roadmap and their development plans. So those are the kind of outcomes that are being felt all across the region. But notwithstanding that, I don't think it's done anything to impair the general level of optimism and excitement about the ability to change insurance for the good. So that's by way of background in terms of COVID-19 and how it's impacting the members of our organizations across Asia Pacific. Now I'd like to launch straight into a discussion on what is the situation in your local market and what's particularly interesting in the Insurtech space. Hopefully people can learn from that. George, you probably can speak on behalf of the most diverse region among our panelists here.
Thanks, Kai. Yeah, I appreciate a chance to come together. I think this has really been an exciting time for the region. We've started Insurtech Asia in 2016, and it's really been growing. And when we first started, it was really like early days, like you said, 2010 when it was first started as an Insurtech concept. But overall, I think the awareness of Insurtech hasn't really picked up until about 2016, where it's really been something that has been a lot more on top of minds for a lot of people. So as Insurtech Asia, we started as an association to really bring everybody together around the region. We're HQ'd in Singapore, and the big focus for us is still across Southeast Asia, because there are so many markets just in the vicinity here, and Southeast Asia itself is a fairly fragmented market. So we've been focusing a lot on bridging these markets together, focusing on the education components, focusing on the awareness components, and really driving that collaboration. One of the initiatives that we did, and that's been very well received, has been that roadshow where we did 5 days in 5 countries. We brought startups across all these markets together, and that's been a very well received both from the insurers as well as the startups. We've seen a lot of the collaboration come out from this type of models where it is still a very face-to-face interaction markets. And as we see that developing further, I think there is going to be a lot more opportunities as all these markets come together. So in terms of the region overall, I think the challenges and opportunities is Southeast Asia and Asia markets are fairly fragmented, and there's quite a variety of different stages of the development. So we have markets like Singapore, which is highly advanced and developed, and other markets are in the various stages of development across the region, which creates a challenges of scalability. So for a lot of the startups that have started in one market, they are always looking at how do they expand it to the next market? How do they grow into something that is a much larger scale and call across? And that's been really where we found that education of the regulators, education of the insurers, alignment of the different countries has been a big focus for us. Also, together with that, I guess the other focus has been in terms of educating the insurers. Still 90+% of the region is still using intermediaries as their primary distribution mechanism. We see it again as a challenge and an opportunity altogether because it is still a fairly traditional ways of doing business in Southeast Asia, but there's a lot of pent-up demand for digital as well. Thankfully, we're not as in the stage of fax machine, so we're a little bit ahead of it. There's other markets like China, which is just leapfrogging ahead, miles and miles ahead, where Southeast Asia is probably somewhere in between as well.
Southeast Asia, of course, is lots of different markets. So in some you'll have very high penetration, in others you'll have very minimal penetration, right?
Absolutely right.
Thanks for that, George. I'm sure that'll prompt a few more questions, which we'll get to later on. Rita, do you want to talk a little bit about Australia and what's happening there?
Sure, thanks, Kai. It is really great to be here today, the very first ever GITA event. So it's great that the APAC region could get that happening, and looking forward to many more. So I thought I'd just start with a super quick snapshot of the insurance landscape more broadly here in Australia. Financial services and insurance really captures around 10% of the gross economic value in Australia. So it is a very large segment, and it employs about 3.6% of people across Australia as well. In terms of general insurance, there are 4 main players that capture the majority of the market there in terms of market share, which is similar to some of the other regions I know. And that's, anywhere between 55 and 75%, depending on the segment that you're looking at specifically. Switching to life insurance is a little bit more evenly spread, the market share across the top 10 main players, and the top 10 account for about 95% of the market here. So if we look at more broadly the startup ecosystem here in Australia, I actually came across the Startup Blink ecosystem report that came out last week. It's an annual report that looks at the top 100 companies and rates them in terms of their startup ecosystems. And Australia actually ranked 7th this year, which was actually not super surprising to me, but it was really good to see that. And I think we were the highest rated out of all of the APAC countries. So we do have a fairly supportive startup ecosystem, more broadly speaking, and very supportive of tech and innovation. Switching now to Insurtech Australia, more specifically, and the Insurtech ecosystem here in Australia. We were established in 2017. And around that time, I think similar to George, it was just around the time when Insurtech as a potential industry started really gaining a lot more momentum and interest here in Australia, both from the startup ecosystem as well as the insurance ecosystem. So we were established as an organisation, and initially we had about 10 corporate partners come on board as founding partners. So we were very lucky to have incumbent support from day one. We had a handful of Insurtech members, so not a huge amount of members at that point in time that represented startups and scale up. And we have grown over the last couple of years to the point where we now have 65 Insurtech members, startups and scale-ups, operating right across the value chain. And we have around about 10% of those are international Insurtechs scaling into the Australian region as well. And on the flip side, we have 24 corporate incumbent partners. So they come from insurers, broking firms, legal firms, consulting firms, and others that operate across the insurance value chain or provide services to insurance more broadly. So obviously we've experienced quite a bit of growth over that period of time. First and foremost, our goal is to create a world-leading Insurtech ecosystem here in Australia. And a lot of that is about not only supporting the number of Insurtechs and the scale of Insurtechs in the region, but it's also supporting the incumbents and their digital and innovation strategies that they have, and then providing the connections in between the two. So all of our initiatives really focus on three main things, which is advocate, educate, and facilitate, and providing connections between those within our ecosystem for some sort of mutual benefit. So we started out in 2017 as a division of FinTech Australia. That made sense at the time when we had a very, very small number of Insurtechs operating in Australia and other regions. We saw ourselves as a part of FinTech. But during the last few years, particularly driven by the growth that we've experienced, but also driven by the fact that our objectives within our ecosystem are quite different to the FinTech ecosystem in Australia, which is a lot more disruptive. If you think about the neobanks starting to operate in this region here, Insurtech is very much more a collaborative ecosystem. So last June, we became an independent organisation separate to FinTech Australia with our own objectives, our own board and our own governance structure, which has been really positive. We'll also next month see the release of our third Insurtech ecosystem report across Australia, which we put together each year with EY. It's a really good snapshot and provides a lot of really great statistics about the status of maturation of partnerships across the region, the number of Insurtechs operating in this region and where they're playing along the value chain, amongst a whole host of other things, and provides an ecosystem map placing all of those Insurtechs at various points along the value chain, I should say. Global connectedness is a key objective for us to support our members with. And part of the reason for that is Australia is relatively quite a small market. So most Insurtechs here in Australia are looking to develop their propositions as being global propositions from day one, and do have the goal of scaling internationally at some point along their journey. So it is really great to be a part of this group, and I'm looking forward to seeing us do more together in the future.
Great, thanks Rita. So let's go to New Zealand. Jason, welcome to you as well. If you want to tell us a little bit about the Insurtech scene here in New Zealand.
Thank you for inviting us all, and it's obviously this collaboration getting out of touch is fantastic. Look, why don't I just quickly start on the foundations of Insurtech and just link it through to a marketplace here, and then I'll just come back where we're at. So Insurtech New Zealand is actually a working group of FinTech New Zealand with a member group under the Insurtech Alliance. And so for us, FinTech is very important as a part of our parent group and part of our parent base. And also given that many of our insurers and bankers and all across the overarching financial services sector often tend to be intertwined and linked. So it makes sense to us for a smaller country to work together and collaborate in that way to leverage opportunity. New Zealand isn't called, it is called the Shaky Islands for a reason. The fact that we're part of the Ring of Fire and we have this problem with earthquakes and volcanoes and all sorts of things. So this has led to a country that has started its insurance world very much motivated by looking after its citizens, and to some extent led to the growth of some larger public institutions. We call them Accident Compensation Earthquake Commission, and that actually helps us address bigger areas. And behind that, we've had then the insurers have come in various areas over time of domestic insurance, business insurance, and so on. So our market has got the strong influence from the government sort of public sector that's helped form our foundations. And then, of course, over time, we've had the influence of often international companies who have managed to exert quite a lot of influence over the New Zealand marketplace. So within New Zealand, whilst we have a pretty strong local insurance-owned marketplace, we do tend to live within the context of the bigger players overseas, who mean that the services they provide tend to be not quite made in New Zealand for New Zealand. So that's a strong focus of where Insurtech has also started to think about what it needs. So how do we get services made for our market in New Zealand? Somebody mentioned before about disintermediated market. Well, we're probably less reliant on the disintermediated market now. It's changing as insurers become more powerful about direct services to their own customers and the rise of digital services, which is improving some aspects. So we are quite advanced around digital processes and how that's really accelerated services to our customers. Having said that, of course, there's some big drivers for Insurtech. That's around usually customer experience, the real need to digitise more and to provide a more seamless experience. Try and get that across the claims value chain, across all points of contact, so there's no single point touches, and also back-end processes, which obviously is such a driver. So we have our challenges like so many markets. I would say primarily for us, it's the smaller market. I mean, we're the minnow of this group here today, and that has its own challenges around funding, which I'm sure we'll get to later on. Just like most of you here, we've been around this in an Insurtech group since 2017 as well, I believe, and grown really focused on how do we improve customer experience, how do we add value to our members, primarily a mix of Insurtechs, incumbents, NZ tech providers, investors, and to some extent the regulators, who we've been very fortunate to have quite a strong relationship with. And to that extent, our relationships with our regulators tend to be more guided by what we should do as opposed to what they shall do. And that's been beneficial for us in terms of guiding and developing services. But more recently, we've been under the spotlight, perhaps like many countries around the world, with whether or not we're really looking after our customers enough. And that's led to some investigation around life insurance, making sure that, it's not too much stacked in the favour of the life insurer, and things like capital investment and so on. So we've got our challenges, but ultimately as a member group, we really want to help our very active and interested Insurtechs and innovators to reach out and get outside of New Zealand, because we are fundamentally an export-driven company. And of our three top earners, which is agriculture that many of you know about, tourism was number 2. Unfortunately, taking a real big hit now. Technology is number 3, within which FinTech's a very important part. So we obviously have a really strong focus on accelerating tech innovation. I think it's probably enough for now, given the clock's ticking. And back to you, Kai.
There is a question for you, which might be just as well deal with it straight away. What do you think is driving the uptake by customers of a direct offering in New Zealand, as this isn't occurring to the same extent in Australia?
It's probably to do with customer expectation. I think we've benefited from contactless transacting and all sorts of digital experiences that now customers are asking more of. And I'm sure that's a trend we'll see even more of as we get more used to our mobile devices ruling our lives.
It's also a difference between commercial and personal insurance, of course, isn't it?
Of course.
Thanks, everybody. That's great. And we're getting some questions come in. Insurtech often involves many regulatory requirements. These requirements and the ability of the Insurtech to comply often worries potential corporate partners. How can this group help early stage businesses navigate these challenges? And should this group be challenging regulators so the legislative settings don't inadvertently stymie innovation? I'm going to actually throw that first, Rita, because I know Australia's had such an incredible focus from regulators recently. Maybe you want to comment on that.
Yeah, look, it's a difficult one. And I think our market in particular has experienced such a great deal of focus on regulation, some of which changes have been held off for a period of time going through this current crisis. It's also a difficult one because we have previously delved into policy advocacy and policy support and attempted to really make change in that way. And it has proved very difficult. And whilst we are really open to having regulators as part of our ecosystem, and certainly do have regulators as part of our ecosystem, it's not something that we have the capacity to really drive head on ourselves as an organisation, being completely blunt about it, because it's just too big and too much to actually handle to really make headway into it as an organisation. So I think it really takes actually an ecosystem approach, which is why we have built this ecosystem. And we have partners within our ecosystem such as ANZIF, and they play a major role in actually supporting activities around policy advocacy and so forth. So we've aligned ourselves with organisations like that so that we can drive forwards initiatives through other partners.
I know Insurtech New Zealand does as much as it can to include and incorporate people like the Financial Markets Authority who regulate market conduct into our discussions. We're not lobbyists, but at the same time, what happens in New Zealand to try and at least create that ecosystem benefit of that participation?
Yeah, I do think collaboration's a really important part. We're kind of lucky in New Zealand. We're small enough to almost be able to pick up the phone or talk to someone at a conference, jack up a meeting. So we have that intimacy of a small marketplace. But I do believe that the influences in our context, we work a lot with the Financial Services Council, which is a major participant in the influence world. Transparency New Zealand, which is often to do with regulation and engagement with the financial services. And then, of course, the Insurance Council and one or two others. So our ability and even the ability to have staff from FMA come to speak at our events and engage in our working groups. So we've got the fortune of being able to talk personally with folk. But it doesn't necessarily mean we can affect change, but it does help lubricate the wheels and help keep the conversations alive.
George, within Insurtech Asia, of course, you've got the challenge of multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple regulatory systems, multiple tax systems. There's probably only a very limited amount you can actually undertake there, but at the same time, you can't ignore it because it's really relevant still. How does it look from your perspective?
So from our perspective, how we approach it is very much about the education and just being there, working in a collaborative way again with the regulator. So what we've seen is that in increasing cases where the regulators are coming to us, trying to understand what's happening, trying to understand what's happening in the other regions as well. So we've been, again, act as a bridging entity where we say to one regulator that they should speak to the other regulator because there's some interesting approaches that they have taken. We've seen, for example, that Singapore has probably been at the forefront of some of the regulatory aspects where they've taken a risk-based approach to regulation, even for the Insurtechs. Meaning that they just say, if you want to start something, just go ahead and start it because the risk is so small. Both the insurer as well as the startup should be able to assess it. So we've been referencing that to some of the other regulators that we've been speaking to about it so that they also have an idea of how potentially to reduce the hurdles to the progress in their locations. So I guess, yeah, it's less about like pushing it more rather than more about like influencing an education process.
Let's just shift a little bit here. There's a question that I don't want to miss. George, keen to get your thoughts on why the Chinese digital ecosystem model hasn't taken up in a big way in other APAC countries.
They are leading, I guess, a lot of progressive things in China. The biggest thing that Chinese market have seen that Southeast Asia has not is that digital technology really have converged in China. Somebody who is in their 80s going to the market and using WeChat to purchase things and everything is digital payments is just provides that foundational digital adoption to a much, much higher grade. Even last few days that I'm speaking to Chinese insurers, they say that technology by itself now is table stakes in China. It's just been advanced so far, leapfrogging ahead so much. They say that we're interested in kind of next generation, what's going to come after, where I think Southeast Asia is still on probably a phase one where we say like, okay, digital payments is increasing, but it is still a fairly early adoption of it across the markets. Adoption of mobile is definitely picking up very, very healthy here, but it's still not used for a lot of the transactional capabilities. So I think as we see, Southeast Asia is definitely converging towards the Chinese model, but it's still not at that kind of a state of maturity, I would say. And that's probably where we see the difference of Insurtech reflecting that.
Yeah, it seems to me that China also almost completely skipped the construction of a legacy insurance industry and went straight to a more modern iteration, which means that they probably have less to overcome. And the second part of that question is actually to all panelists. Are you seeing any new product propositions being conceptualized for catering to the emerging customer demands in post-COVID world? How about Australia, Rita?
Yeah, look, it's not necessarily anything new, but what we have seen is that there has been an absolute increase in uptake on things like virtual tools that are enabling insurers and incumbents to perform different tasks and parts of their role virtually. So that could be assessments of damage, for example. And they've realised actually how quickly it is to implement that type of technology in their business when they actually have to, because they have people isolated and working from home and not able to get out to sites and so forth. So that has certainly been very obvious. I think the other is that there's a lot more discussion now, and it relates back to what we've all talked about around customer demands, but a lot more discussion around things like subscription models for insurance and on-demand insurance and much more flexible insurance options in the future. considering what we've all just been through. And if you take the example of motor insurance, which has not been used for a period of time by many people because they have been isolated and they've been confined to their homes, it's become obvious to consumers that that doesn't necessarily fit what their requirement is.
All of you have spoken strongly about how you insurtech organisations support incumbents. What are the ways in which each of you are doing this? So Jason, do you want to start with that one?
Bit of a tricky question, that one. I feel like there's sometimes a gap between the interests of insurtechs and funders and the startup communities at times and those of our incumbents. And how do you collaborate with this mutual interest? Perhaps even New Zealand's market, because of the larger domination of our marketplace by external companies, makes accessibility harder. So for us to engage has been harder at times. Having said that, the way in which we're trying to do that is to collaborate with some of the partners I mentioned before, and also just invite and involve our larger organisations to work with us at a leadership level and our other areas of member engagement. So it's probably more of inclusion. What I do notice is that many of our insurtechs are generally doing really well themselves at engaging in the local market, and that is a really good thing. The one rider to that is that virtually all of our insurtechs, whilst they're augmenting the local market, they're actually designing products for export for international purposes, and that's a challenge for our market. Whilst it's important, it can be a barrier at times as well.
Rita, I was really impressed with your summary on how you've managed to engage a high number of insurtechs, but also a high number of incumbents, and also embedded it into your mission statement. So how does that work for you guys?
Yeah, we have been very lucky over the years to have such great incumbent support. But the way that we look at it is that our ecosystem relies on the incumbents being involved and playing an active role for the ecosystem to thrive. So I think the figure is about 95% of the insurtechs operating in Australia are enablers. So they're looking to work with and partner with incumbents in some way. So if we only had a group of insurtechs on their own, we probably wouldn't really be making too much of an impact. So in reality, some of the things that we actually do and some of the initiatives that we focus on to continue to get involvement and support the incumbent side is a fewfold. One is obviously on the education front, and that happens at many levels within certain organisations. But then on a broader level, we run a lot of events for our ecosystem. We aim to create connections between the insurtechs and the incumbents, and that could be on an ad hoc basis or it could be on a much more sort of specific level. So I guess an example of one of the initiatives that we ran late last year and will do more of in the future is a reverse pitch that we ran for a group of 3 life insurers, where effectively they pitched their problems to an audience of interested insurtechs that potentially could solve those problems. And then the insurtechs in the audience actually applied to each of those, whichever was relevant, problem statements that they could potentially work with and solve. And then that was obviously shortlisted, and it led to more very specific discussions between the incumbents and the insurtechs, as opposed to a random connection or a random meeting. So I guess that's one example of a specific initiative that we have run, but there's obviously a big focus for us on making sure that all of our initiatives also support the incumbents within our ecosystem as well as the insurtechs.
Perfect. George, I understand in Singapore that's done a lot as well, where
So no, it was something that we've tried in the past. What we also realized that there needs to be a filtering mechanism where those problem statements, it's easy for the insurers to come up with, but they need to be, the commitment from them to actually go through with the solution has always been a challenge. You know, we find them, let's say 5 different startups that can solve this problem for them. They go away and 6 months later, they're still in the discussion phase. And that's generated quite a bit of frustration from obviously from the insurtech side, because the velocity is very different across the two. So what we've done is use this as a bit of a filtering mechanism to say, okay, actually out of the insurers that have come up with these problems, there's ones that are more committed to it, and there's going to be certain ones that are less committed or probably less have a less of a velocity. In that sense, I think that's kind of how we've facilitated this dialogue or this process to really drive the collaboration, but also in a very proactive way.
I've got one topic that I did want to get to. How do you help organizations scale up across borders? George, I started with Southeast Asia. Why don't we go there?
So the way that we've seen so far work the best is, I think it's still fairly traditional, where they reach out to us and we try to connect them to the right parties based on our experience. And this could involve both the regulators or the incumbents, or even the potential partners like the other startups that are in the complementary segment. So we know the landscape of the region fairly well. And this is where we try to work with the startups to really help them. What we've also done is the road shows and more of a proactive efforts that we hope to resume after this whole COVID thing blows over, because the face-to-face element is definitely an important one for scalability.
Jason, why don't you quickly talk about government programs perhaps here that can help?
Yeah, well, we're very fortunate, really. We've got a number of channels, but just very briefly, New Zealand used to invest 2% of its GDP into technology investment. It's now 3%. So in the last 2 years, there's been a big growth in investment, and that's supported through our distribution arms. In case of New Zealand, it's Hasnt, it's ATED, and a bunch of others I won't name necessarily over here. But what you're seeing now is more engagement in terms of channel to market. So New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, for example, in Singapore, George, are very active connecting our marketplaces to the Asian marketplaces. And indeed, this session we're doing today of a collaboration and reaching out and engaging is a very good example of the way that we do this. So we obviously have the funding side. We have, even today, we were supposed to be in the Insurtech event in Singapore, which New Zealand Trade and Enterprise and all of us on this call actually had joined together with joining. So kind of fortunate that we're here today. So there are a bunch of initiatives. There are private ones as well, and that very much relies on funding. And I won't take up time on this call, but it's a very important part of helping companies export and grow internationally.
Look, in summary, I think all people on this call are available and can be contacted for any further dialogue on this. So without further ado, I want to thank everybody who has attended and shown interest in this session. We hope to run more if there's, and I want to particularly thank the panelists who've been excellent. It's been a really, really good discussion, and have a good day, everybody.